We'll bring the meeting to order and welcome everyone to the Wednesday, May 14th, 2025 meeting of the Planning Commission for the City of Liberty Lake. We'll begin with our roll call, please.
Joe Mann,
Here.
Tom Sahlberg,
Here.
Jim Baumker,
Here.
DG Garcia, Charlie Jenks,
Here.
Dale Robbins,
Here.
Phil Foyer,
Here.
Gene Huschel, and Troy Mullenix. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Would you please stand and join me for the pledge to the flag? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. We will begin with reviewing the agenda for tonight's meeting. Anyone have any changes or additions to the agenda?
I would actually like to suggest, I don't think this is significant, but we're going to flip-flop the presentations. We're going to go with climate vulnerability first and then move into the GHG, just it flows better.
Okay. Move to approve the agenda as recommended with changes.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Yeah. And we need to excuse both Commissioner Garcia and Commissioner Herschel. Can I hear a motion for approval for their absence? Move to approve. Second. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Everyone had a chance to review the minutes from last meeting. Any changes or additions to the minutes from last meeting? Motion to approve? Move to approve. Thank you. Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. We'll begin our workshops with climate vulnerability and risk assessment. Mr. Phillips.
Hi, I am not Mr. Phillips. Instead, I am Beth Miller. John is in Italy, unfortunately for us, and fortunately for him. So I'm going to talk about the resiliency portion, and my colleague Natty, who also did a lot of the GHG analysis, is going to talk about the greenhouse gas portion.
Thank you.
So Beth,
Shall I just share?
yes, and I think I have to stop my share.
Okay.
Go for it.
Let's make sure I can share. There we go. And I would like to share slideshow. How's that looking?
Great.
Great. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for this. It is so we've been working hard to get these portions of the climate element together. You should all have seen these two memos that we sent you in our in your packet. So I know they're long, but we're going to go through them today. Let's see, make sure I can. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start with sort of refreshing our overview of the climate element, talk about the resilience subelement, talk about the greenhouse gas subelement, and then sort of give you an overview of when you're going to have to see us again. All right, so I've presented it to you before. I'm happy to take any questions, interrupt me if you need clarification, anything like that. So please feel free, right? This is a workshop. So this is your work combining with my work. So let's get to it. All right, so the climate element, just as a refresher, you guys have seen this several times, but Washington State required this climate element as part of the comprehensive planning process. It requires that communities address climate change in their comp plans, lower the greenhouse gas and make plans to lower the greenhouse gas emissions, and increase resilience to future climate conditions and do so in a way that doesn't unjustly affect any members of their community. Right. Next, here's where we are in this step. So we've gone through and done all of our analysis and things like that. And so now we are establishing goals and starting to really put together the policies that we're going to see in the climate element. Yeah, so we're going to start with the resiliency sub-element, and we will move on to the climate element, the GHG element after that. Right. And like I said, you should have both of these big old honkers of memos in your packet. And so feel free to ask me any questions on this. For the resilience sub-element, okay, so starting just sort of with the overview of Liberty Lake, you sit on top of your Spokane Valley Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer. So that's where your water comes from. And there's some topographic stuff going on. You've got steep hills in the east and sort of on this southwest part. So, but important to note for Liberty Lake is that you don't actually touch the river or the lake. So there's almost no floodplain included, at least not under the current FEMA standards. So that's important to note. So when we go through and do a climate vulnerability analysis, we evaluated 6 types of risk that are relevant to Liberty Lake, right? We're not that worried about sea level rise here. So we looked here at temperature, decreased snowpack, and that's a threat to your aquifer, wildfire smoke, extreme precipitation, and then landslides. And we go through and categorize all these risks as high, moderate, or low. So that's sort of what's physically going to happen, but then how's that going to affect the people that live in Liberty Lake? So that's when we talk about vulnerability. So it refers to how much someone could be impacted by a given hazard. And we think about vulnerability as sort of the combination of 3 factors: exposure, how much or how often someone is going to be exposed to that hazard. So for example, someone that worked outside or maybe a student athlete might be highly exposed to extreme heat, for example. Sensitivity, how sensitive that individual is to that hazard. So someone with asthma is going to be more sensitive to poor air quality, or someone who is pregnant would be more sensitive to a lot of these hazards, temperature and air quality and things like that. And then the last one is adaptive capacity. So that's how a person or a community can respond to a hazard that they experience. So how much ability they have to help themselves out of that hazard. So that can be things like income level. If your basement floods and you don't have a whole lot of spare money on hand to deal with it, you would be in much worse shape than someone that could just easily hire someone else to handle it for them. Or people that can't walk on their own would have a little bit less of adaptive capacity to adapt to something that required them to move quickly away from a hazard, for example. Okay. So what do these populations look like in Liberty Lake? So in Liberty Lake, this includes retirement-aged adults, school-aged children, anybody with lower income families, people of color, people who live alone can often be at more vulnerable to climate hazards, and people with chronic diseases or health concerns. So this is just to note, these hazards, this vulnerability is really spread across your whole community, right? So everybody, if they're lucky enough, will get old. For example, everybody starts young. So these are the kind of things that these vulnerabilities are really pretty distributed into your community. And so this is a picture of after the Lahaina fires in Hawaii. And I just wanted to note that about 70% of the people that died in those fires were 60 years old or older. So that was an issue with just being able to get people out of the way of the fire when they're living in sort of retirement, senior living centers. They need more help moving, can't move as fast. So just think about, who in your community might need that kind of help and how we can plan to make sure that they get the help when they need it. Any questions on vulnerability? Okay, move on. All right, so now we're going to dive into climate projections and what kind of hazards we might expect to see in the future in Liberty Lake. All right, so the first one, sort of the big one that you're probably already noticing is an increase in extreme heat. So historically, so we're defining this for Liberty Lake as days over 100 degrees. In other places that have different climates, that might be lower or higher, but in Liberty Lake, it makes sense to look at days over 100. Historically, this has only been about one day a year. But by the 2050s, we expect to see about 6 days a year. And by the end of the century, it's more like 24 days. So that's a really big shift in what the summer itself looks like. And this just means the community needs to be prepared to deal with that, right? More energy for cooling. You'll need more places to cool off, like this awesome splash pad. You need to make sure that we are adapting our outdoor work to keep people safe during those kinds of heat events, and making sure that people know how to keep cool and checking on people that maybe are isolated in their homes. So along with sort of those extreme heat events, the whole sort of climate experience of summer especially is going to shift. So for those of you that are gardeners, I feel like I experience my climate primarily through what plants grow and what plants don't. So this might give you a better idea of how sort of the overall climate is expected to shift. So your current cold hardiness zone is about 6B, and that's going to shift throughout the century from being about 7B. That means what kind of plants can survive the winter in your town. So it's going to be more like Roswell, New Mexico by the middle of the century, and more like El Paso, Texas by the end of the century. And that's the same for your growing season length. You'll have a considerably longer time to grow your tomatoes or whatever it is that you're wanting to grow. But also your heat tolerance zone is going to shift from 4 or 5 up to about 7, which is more like sort of the heat experienced in Kennewick. So it's not so far away, but it really does experience a very different heat level. And so you might have already been experiencing some of this. It's been observed that some trees are more resilient to the heat, seeing some die off of street trees. So the temperature, that kind of climate, like overall experience of summer is going to change. Which trees you need to plant, what do you put in your garden, how do you design your parks? All of those things are ways that Liberty Lake can adapt to that kind of heat. All right, so any questions on heat before I move on? All right, so wildfire is, of course, a huge one on everybody's minds. We all now have like fire tracking apps on our phones and think about AQI and smoke and things like that. So that it will continue to be true for Liberty Lake. It's a relatively high risk area for wildfires. So the number of high fire danger days. It's expected to increase over the next 25 years from about 48 days per year to about 58 days per year. So this just means that the community needs to make sure it plans for what to do in case of a wildfire, right? So water pressure for putting out multiple building fires, evacuation planning, transportation planning to make sure that people who live even closer to fire danger out east of you mostly can get to I-90 if they need to through Liberty Lake and do that safely and efficiently. And also just making sure that your communication systems are designed so that you reach the people that need to be reached in the case of a fire. And even if it's not fire directly at your doorstep, smoke is still going to be a problem because other forests will be burning. So we've all experienced increased smoke days. So this is about planning for having filtration. It's about addressing places that maybe the most vulnerable people are, like daycare centers, making sure that things continue to function even on those like really heavy smoke days. Right. Sorry, I didn't mean to go so fast. Anybody have any questions about fire and smoke? All right, so now we're going to talk about snowpack. So Liberty Lake relies on that Rathdrum Prairie aquifer for its water. And so that aquifer is charged by basically snowpack in the Rocky Mountains. So there's a reduction in the snowpack expected and projected for pretty much the entire Columbia River Basin, including the mountains that charge the Rathdrum aquifer. And so that really means that snowpack is what's holding on to the precipitation you get in the winter and doling it out through the summer, through the dry season, so that you still have water in the summer. So so that reduction in late season snowpack especially is what's going to mean more severe and long-term drought in that aquifer.
Beth, isn't our snowpack more affected by the Bitterroot in our mountains around here than it is by the Rockies? And the reason I ask is because we have some people here who went up and actually measured the snowpack for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so your nearest mountain ranges for sure, which are all sort of part of the Rocky Mountains in general. That is my understanding of how I think about the Rocky Mountains, but for sure the more nearby, they are all projected to decrease snowpack. But as you pointed out, it was a really good snow year this year, which is awesome and really helpful in delaying some of these impacts. But the projection is still a decline with some spikes and decreases through time.
So in looking at the climate change, it's also projected to be more moisture in this area, more because of the warming ocean temperatures. The air will have more moisture in it, and we're projected to have more precipitation, either in the form of rain or snow. But I appreciate the issue with respect to snowpack and how it helps or acts as a storage of moisture to feed in through the aquifer during the summer months. So the question I have is, in a geography where you're reliant on your aquifer for water, is there any way of, and I know this aquifer it flows like very fast. And it all flows out, I presume, to the Columbia River. Is that where ultimately it flows?
Yeah.
So is there, in terms of mitigation, could there be water storage then that could be captured downstream and then pumped back up here? Is that something that would be a consideration or as a way to mitigate the depletion of the snowpack?
I would look to more storage upstream. So you would look to trying to preserve the water in the existing, so there are a lot of existing lakes and reservoirs. Dam building is not super popular right now, but that is part of what dams do is hold the water. There's also sort of alternative storage mechanisms that so I would say there are ways. We haven't done a lot of it yet. So we have done it in terms of making these dammed reservoirs for sure, but how to do that and balancing it with river health and downstream water demands. I've seen some. I was just talking to my colleague John, who wrote this resiliency account, and he was telling me about plans to have sort of a run of the water reservoir where it fills only when the river is high enough to fill over a spillway, and then it fills sort of an abandoned farm field that becomes a giant lake in the winter and then is let out of the river in the summer. There are definitely ways to do it. We could think of all sorts of ways, but I would like to note that this is like a big regional project, right? Preserving that water is a whole region, multi-country even project. So it's really not so easy. Now, in a smaller way, right? You could have small scale water reservoirs, right? You could have smaller ones that might supply your water for several days, maybe even up to a week. But the kind of volume that those, the snowpack holds is really hard to reproduce.
Thanks, Beth.
Okay. It is a hard one. This one is the one that keeps me up at night, is thinking about loss of snowpack and therefore loss of water storage. Yeah. Okay. So, but as you noted, we also expect increased precipitation in the winter specifically, right? We've got dry season, wet season going on here. So we expect to see increased storm severity. What I'm showing you in this graphic is inches of precipitation in 24 hours, historically and through the 2080s. And for an extreme storm, which is just has a 4% chance of happening every year. So it's your 25-year storm. And then for a more usual storm, 50-50 odds of happening every year, 2-year storm, looking at the increase in water content of those storms. So we do expect to see heavier storms, not wildly heavier, but heavier storms throughout the next century. So this is where stormwater planning comes in, trying to harvest as much of that water and putting it into the aquifer as you can. You already have like pretty darn good stormwater planning. This also, because a lot of this is going to fall as snow, as probably slightly warmer, heavier snow. So that means heavier snow loads. And so that means increasing your building codes to make sure that roofs can handle that, which I believe you have already done. So that's super awesome. You're already thinking about this. So nice job. Any questions on storm severity? Okay. So the last one that we looked at was landslides, but really there's very little risk of landslides in Liberty Lake. So I don't even have a slide to show you on it. It's not very interesting. It's just not a problem. Yay. All right, so now I'm going to go through the risk assessment for each of these things. So you'll see my screen is over here, so I keep gesturing to my screen here. So the climate risks are listed in the rows. Then we have the impact, which means how big that disturbance is going to be. The probability of it happening. So is this likely to happen or very unlikely to happen? The mitigation difficulty, that means can you do anything about it? And then the overall risk is sort of the sum or product of those three things. Okay, so for temperature, the impact will be pretty high to how you live your lives day to day. The probability is also pretty high. And you can do something about it to some extent, right? You've got air conditioning, you can put in more cooling, you can plant different trees. Plenty of places in the world, even in the country, people have wonderful cities and have thriving towns in conditions like you will have in the future. So overall risk is high, but you can do something about it. Decreased snowpack. So as I discussed, this is something that could have a major impact. The probability is high. Mitigation is difficult, and also then you have to balance the regional growth, increased water demand and hotter summers with trying to preserve that water quality. So it's going to be like take some real thinking and planning and doing, and honestly some creative leadership on that. So the overall risk is high.
Question, and this goes back to the information, Lisa, that I forwarded you yesterday. Under somewhere between temperature and decreased snowpack, the risk of the release of heavy metals in the bottom of Lake Coeur d'Alene is I think it's a real risk. I think the mitigation is probably moderate, but I think it's still something that should be listed.
Okay. That's I have not heard of that, and I will forward that to my colleague who wrote this. So
Beth, I will be happy to forward the links.
Yeah.
Shared with me to you guys.
Okay,
Thank
great. Yeah, I mean that
We have
definitely when water levels get low.
I
Go
have,
ahead.
Lisa, one question. On number one in temperature, it talks about impact probability, mitigation difficulty as moderate. Do you foresee any changes to the landscape design criteria in the city to help with street trees in terms of size, planting, distance, those kinds of changes to that section of the code to help with this kind of issue?
I actually do, and that actually is one of the goals that has come out of this process as it relates to looking at climate resiliency, climate resilient trees, tree canopy, biodiversity, because trees are a great way to mitigate the heat island effect that comes as you continue to develop, maintaining green space, all very, very important. And you'll see that there are some goals specifically related to that element.
That anticipate changes to the requirements.
Yes, and that will take some time. We now have an arborist on our city force, and he will be helping us look at some of that as we overhaul our codes. So
Thank you.
sure.
Right. All right, so moving on to wildfires, high impact, right? Pretty high probability. And again, you can definitely do some Firewise work to decrease your risk there, but overall, it's going to come out as high. I'd like to note that there are only 3 categories here: high, moderate, and low. So there's different levels of high in this. So just you're wondering why are all 3 of those high when 2 of them have moderate mitigation difficulty?
Just another note is that there recently was an article about Avista burying power lines going up to Micah as an attempt to mitigate that risk of a wildfire. And I'm just wondering if that's something that we would expect more of, to be burying of those. At least the article seemed to indicate that that was a mitigation strategy on the part of Avista.
I think that that's absolutely correct, and I think that it's becoming a liability to them.
Yeah.
And one of the things I will say is that our city code right now does require all utility lines to be buried, with the exception of the higher capacity. So anything that's transmitting over 50,000 kilowatt hours. So the major transmission lines, those are a little bit more challenging to bury, but I suspect that Avista will have to begin to look at addressing those as well in the not too distant future.
Lisa, does the city, I mean, well, every once in a while I get an alert on my phone, I'm sure we all do, or on the TV. Does the city have any in-city alert system? Like a civil defense system they could use to address things like wildfire danger or smoke?
So we don't, but one of the things that we're doing, in fact, we're just kicking off an update to the hazard mitigation plan, countywide hazard mitigation plan. And we, the city, do have an annex. We are looking at, one of the things that we are looking at as part of this is really having a much more robust emergency management plan. We are beginning that process at the director's level. We're doing that kind of work. One of the things that we will be doing as part of this climate grant in the second biennium is we are actually going to be specifically looking at transportation resiliency, so that we can beef up our ability to evacuate should we need to. But there are a lot of other things we can
So
do.
knowing where people are
Yes,
and helping get them out.
yes.
Beth, as part of the wildfire risk assessment, it looks like you guys took a little bit of a look at it, but there's something that we haven't really discussed yet. And I go back to the Lahaina fires. I'm very familiar with those. We have property on Maui, and there's huge issues with not only the cleanup, but some of the contamination that happens after fires as far as groundwater, but you also have contamination in the air. And part of the problems that they're having over there, even with the rebuilding, is that things, quote unquote, get cleaned up, but then they can get recontaminated with things such as trade winds or what have you. So is that part of this whole process? Because there's a lot more to it than just the fire itself and the evacuation of the people. It's all the after effects that sometimes aren't thought about or that aren't planned for.
We have not included that in this, but I think that would be a super prudent thing to include in your wildfire resiliency and recovery plans, for sure. Lisa, would that fit well in the climate element, or?
I think it probably fits better in the hazard mitigation planning that the city is undertaking. And I think it's really having plans that go beyond just, oh, what do we do if there's a fire? And to actually look at exactly the remediation as well. And I think it's a really good point, and certainly I will share it with the team that's working on the hazard mitigation plan.
And I think,
Yeah,
not being the construction expert, but that may have something to do with plans with respect to materials that go into future construction?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I will say is that um, there is a lot of information on how you can harden your construction and protect against fire. There's a lot that you can do in terms of material selection, as well as in terms of just what you're doing with your landscaping, et cetera. We will be at one of the outreach town halls that we're going to be doing related to climate resiliency is going to be a fire-wise training. And so we are going to, we're going to really dig into the things that homeowners can do, that businesses can do to increase their resiliency against wildfire.
Yeah, I guess what I was proposing, and I don't know the answer, but are there building materials that could be used that would be less toxic in the event of a fire?
I believe so, yes. And I believe that that's some of what, it's not just, I mean, if it's a material that won't burn, you won't have an issue of.
True. What are those?
All steel homes.
Yeah, and so one of the
Yeah.
things is one of the things that the state has been looking at the building code level at what they call WUI standards, and
I'm
yes,
sorry,
WUI, WIU,
that's,
wild, WUI, wild urban interface,
Mm.
and standards for construction that really harden those edges that butt up against the more wild lands. And there's been a lot of discussion. It hasn't made it into the building code yet. They're trying to refine the science behind identifying that, but it is something that the state is moving towards.
but also, is it also related to the type of furniture and the furnishings that are in the house, or is it mainly the structure itself?
I think it could be both, but you also have to factor in that it's not just fire, you're talking about any natural disaster.
Sure.
So, you know, tailoring your building code towards just fires isn't smart either, because that doesn't solve the problem. It does for fires, but maybe a different natural disaster has other impacts. So your materials for fires wouldn't protect
Like
against
floods after the fire.
Exactly. And then I think the other piece to this, Lisa, is one of the biggest struggles is being able to do the rebuild. And so what are and this may not be in this particular risk assessment part, but what are we doing to make sure that that rebuild process, that there is a process for that, because there isn't in Maui and it's terrible. But if a wildfire comes through Liberty Lake, like it did in Lahaina, you know, what are the steps that are in place to ensure that those loopholes don't get taken advantage of, and that the permitting and cleanup goes according to plan to get the people back in the housing, so that you don't end up with a bunch of unhoused people.
I think those are great questions. I know that there's some discussion at the state level, but they have to go farther. They did change some of the requirements related to the new building code for rebuilding homes that have burned down, just because of the additional cost associated with them and creating an obstacle for people in terms of the rebuild. So there are some things happening that does have to happen at a state level.
Okay.
But you look at what happened to the folks around the lake over here out west where the homes burnt. And they're just, they were paralyzed because they had to have environmental reports with respect to the toxicity around their homes before they could even do anything.
One that lost their home in Lahaina too.
Yeah.
Great conversation.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Okay, well, we're ready. Wildfire smoke. So that you can actually do quite a bit about this, right? You can have air filtration. You can make sure that people have air conditioning in their homes so they don't need to open their windows on really smoky days. You can look to shift patterns of outdoor work and have, AQI limits in place. So it's a moderate risk with wildfire smoke. extreme precipitation, moderate impact. It wasn't like a wild increase in your precipitation, but it's very likely to happen. But you are already taking the steps that you need to do to deal with that increase in precipitation. So that overall is moderate risk. And then, like I said, low risk of landslides, not likely to happen. And so, oh, low risk of landslides, not likely to happen. So we can cross that one off our to-do list. Okay. So the next thing that we want to talk about is how to incorporate all this information into your climate element. So the first thing to do is set up goals, and then you set up policies to address each of those goals. And it is required in the climate element for the resilience chapter that you have policies that address each of the vulnerabilities that you have identified. So to make sure that everything is covered. So what can the city actually do? Like, what are the levers that the city has to increase resiliency? So one of the big ones is to educate the populace about what they should expect to experience and the ways that they can mitigate their own risk. Communication, we already talked about, like, how are we making sure that especially emergency communication reaches the people that it reaches. So that's one big job of the city to make sure that happens right. Plan and implement. The city is doing a lot of this with your stormwater plan and your transportation resiliency plan. So those are examples of, you make the plan, you take into account future climate so that as you go forward, you know how to proceed. And finally, preparedness, right? So this is also on the individual people, right? This is making sure that you have, making sure that people have air filters, and making sure that people who need it have AC in their homes, things like that. Okay, so how we developed these goals, we did this climate and vulnerability risk assessment. And then Department of Commerce has this whole menu of measures that you can go look around online if you want, that they encourage jurisdictions to pull from and then adapt as is appropriate for that jurisdiction. Is there a question?
No.
Okay, just making sure. We have a wonderful climate policy advisory team who have helped us going through the different goals. Yes, many of whom are here today. That's super awesome. Feedback from city planning staff. Lisa and Amy are working really hard on this too. And then one-on-one meetings with selected groups just to make sure that we get a variety of opinions, making sure that we solicit targeted feedback from a variety of people. In this case, it's included community members who are more or less conservative with respect to climate action, low-income housing groups. The Spokane Tribe gave us feedback as well. So we are really trying to make sure that we reach out and make this plan work for Liberty Lake. Okay. All right. So now I'm just going to roll through the goals. They are maybe going to be a little bit obvious after we've already talked about the vulnerabilities. So land use, we need to establish land use patterns that increase the resilience of the built environment, ecosystems, and communities to climate change. So this is making sure that you don't build in high hazard areas or areas that maybe become high hazard in the future. Right? So this is just thinking forward in where we put our things. Water quality and quantity. This is a big one. We already talked about the aquifer. But it also, as you noted, can be compounded by all these other things happening, especially fire can cause big water quality issues. So protecting your aquifer against contamination is a really, really important goal here. And then the next one is cultural resources. So Liberty Lake you know, in this case, it's a lot of your outdoor recreation and natural resources, making sure that those are resilient to climate change. So, you know, this is things like making sure that your golf courses and parks and trails, which are so important to the community, you know, are still usable into the future, are designed to be resilient to drought, things like that. Okay. Your local transportation system. So we want to make sure that this is resilient to all the needs, sure that including infrastructure, routes, and travel modes can all withstand and recover quickly. This includes things like making sure that developments have more than one exit, so that if their people need to evacuate, they can do so safely and effectively. Emergency preparedness. This is a goal to increase community emergency preparedness. So this is sort of on all levels. This could be making sure that your water system can manage big fires, or making sure that you have plans in place for what do you do to rebuild after fires, things like that. The next one is resilient and sustainable buildings, which I think is an interesting one because it's sort of two different things, resilient and sustainable, as we talked about a little bit. Ensure that buildings are designed and built sustainably to reduce environmental impact and remain resilient. So there could be conflict here where the thing that's the most environmentally sustainable might not be as fire resistant, things like that. So it will take some thoughtful balancing of risks and benefits for this one. Okay. Then the next goal is protecting community health and well-being, making sure that people have all the information and materials they need to stay comfortable and safe, air filtration, heat and cooling. This could also include things like vector-borne diseases. For example, as the climate changes, what sort of critters and insects you expect to see and what sort of diseases they might bring with them might also change. We all saw all of the community difficulties that came with trying to respond to something like COVID, making sure that those kinds of things are included in your plan, how to keep people safe, healthy. And finally, we included a public education goal here. So to increase climate literacy among the general population, provide the information to people to increase their knowledge and preparedness, making sure that people know what to do and know what to look out for, so that everybody can continue to be safe and happy and prepared. Right. So that is sort of the end of the resiliency goals. So if there's any more questions, now is a good time to throw them at me before I hand it over to Maddie.
Phil has a question.
Sorry. Thank you. As you were going over the water quality section, I was thinking to myself, how can we, as I listened to this whole workshop, I asked myself, what can the city directly do within our boundaries to impact what has been discussed? And as I think about water quality, I asked a question, and I just asked Google here, is anybody in the city limits on a private well? And the answer is yes, but who it is surprising. And it says some areas are on private well water, like the River District, Ridgeview Middle School, Orchard Park. And I guess we have no authority over our water district. And I know some over in River District are with Consolidated.
Yeah.
All
of the.
So I guess I'm, as we went, that's why we're doing these backwater checks these days, because we've had a contamination a few years ago. So I'm wondering why we have areas in the city that are not on water and sewer water.
So first of all, the private wells at like Orchard Park, at Meadowwood Technology Campus,
Okay.
at Trailhead are irrigation wells.
Oh, okay.
I believe that there's probably We have several older homes that long predate. Some of them were close to the turn of the century over in the River District that are likely still on wells because they haven't yet connected. We did have, I think almost everyone has connected to sewer at this point. I just think I think that some have not yet connected to water.
So which leads me to my question. We know that Liberty Lake Sewer and Water requires us, everybody to do a backwater valve check. What about these private wells? Is that a question for Liberty Lake Sewer and Water, or is that a question for ourselves?
Well, I think that I think that it would be, we'd have to look at, the health department would regulate the private wells.
Right,
So.
so that'd be the county?
Would be yeah, it would be the regional.
Well, you
health
understand why I'm,
district.
one question led me to another, I was like, wait a minute here.
That's something I want to look in, if I may, I'd like to look into it a little bit more and reach out to the regional health district and ask. that
Maybe they
very
require,
question.
it, we just don't know, but yeah. Okay.
I don't think that there's a lot. I think we're talking about a handful of wells.
No, I assume that, but
Right.
when I looked at the regional area here, I was like, why do we have the middle school on a private well? When it was just built not that long ago.
It's not on a private well.
Uh,
It's public water.
That's what you get for believing Google all the time. Thank you.
That dang AI.
All right, thank you.
Yeah,
All right.
so a couple questions on, you talked about loss of snowpack.
Mhm.
And the increasing storms and frequency and the amount of water during rain events. But I didn't see or read any discussion on if we as a community are relying on a groundwater resource for water supply, for domestic source and irrigation supply. I didn't see any discussion on how we could capture that rain in detention basins. And maybe the city simply doesn't have the land to do that, but most jurisdictions that rely on, like the island of Maui, rely on aquifer water for domestic and irrigation source. They have a lot of surface water that they use to irrigate all the sugarcane in the isthmus. It was all surface water. And they should be, and I think they are starting to trend towards large storage from rain events. Do we even talk about that, or?
So a couple things I would say. One of the things that we do, we're not using it necessarily for storage, but we do use our 208 swales as a way to help recharge the
Sure.
aquifer.
Okay.
The other thing that I will say is that, and Liberty Lake Sewer and Water District has been involved in exploring this and looking for opportunities to use purple pipe to basically to recycle the effluent for irrigation purposes.
Are we treating to a tertiary level yet?
I believe that we are. That's a question for Vijay, but
Okay.
I'm pretty certain that we
Well,
are.
I mean, that would help.
Yeah.
That extends the resource significantly because you can
Sure.
cut down on the use of the water for irrigation use.
The other thing I will say is that and I know that you all know this, so forgive me if I'm saying something that you already know, but obviously the Spokane Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer is a massive aquifer. And it's providing water to over 1 million people now in both Washington and Kootenai County. And the all of the water purveyors within this region work together in a bi-state coalition working group to monitor and to plan for and to protect the aquifer. So and representatives from Consolidated Irrigation and Liberty Lake Water and Sewer District are very much engaged with that group.
So
I'll add 370 square miles of it, 10 trillion gallons.
Thank you.
It's a lot of water.
A lot of water.
It's a lot of water, but we're also a rapidly
If you
growing
can
area.
Google.
And it's a resource that it is a resource that we have to view as not being limitless, because.
Right.
And particularly when we see other areas in the country that have really are really having some serious water supply.
So this plan will
challenges.
go out to the utility and they'll come back with information on the aquifer, its sustainability, its sustainable yield, et cetera, et cetera. They'll come back to us with that kind of information.
Sure, absolutely.
And any plan they have for catchment.
But the big but here is that we all have a responsibility to conserve water. And one of the things that you're seeing and in the larger jurisdictions is really pushing for and moving towards xeriscaping, which allowing for other types of landscaping other than turf grass. Turf grass is the biggest waste of water on the face of the planet. It just is. And I know we all love our green lawns and we love our green golf courses, but those are some of some of the things that other jurisdictions are doing is they're actually incentivizing those who control the water. As an example, City of Spokane is actually incentivizing their citizens to replace their lawns with xeriscaping, and they get a reduction in their water bill because they want to encourage that conservation. And that is something that it's a little more challenging here in the city because we're not the water purveyor. So that's not even an option available to us, but it's certainly something that I think that the water purveyors are really starting to consider as they very closely monitor what's happening with the aquifer.
So should there be any discussion in this element about catchment and retaining surface water?
I think that we certainly could look at exploring opportunities for that. I think we're not there yet, but I think that it doesn't hurt to at least lay the foundation for something like that in the future.
Well, I'll add to that then. You said it earlier, our 208 ponds, they're basins, they recharge.
But the water goes
Right.
this way.
Right,
That's
into
prob-
the aquifer that
We're
we're
recharging, yeah.
yeah.
Exactly, we're recharging. So that's probably the most effective way that we can try to support that aquifer is by doing what we do.
Absolutely.
Do we allow injection wells?
So yes, dry wells, but it has to be clean sources. They have to be registered with Department of Ecology. Yes, we do have dry wells.
Lisa?
Yes.
I have one question, kind of going back to what Commissioner Jenks was saying about looking into catch basins or whatever. Is there a contingency plan in place, or has it been talked about that if our friendly neighbors over in Idaho decide that they want to keep some of that aquifer water, and now that 10 trillion gallons or whatever that number is goes down to 5 trillion or 2 trillion because Idaho says we want to keep it all, we're growing faster. Has that discussion come up? I'm sure it has,
So-
at least over here.
And forgive me if I oversimplify this because this is not exactly true, but you gotta imagine the aquifer is this gigantic underground river.
Right.
It's flowing through rocks, but that is effectively what it is. There is no way they could stop it at the bottom.
They can't stop it, but if you talk about how it's recharged and they come up with plans before we do, and they start building reservoirs and dams and all of that, there's all this buddy talk when, between all the water districts and everything, but has there been that discussion? Because who would be hit first if that went into effect? Liberty Lake Valley, Spokane.
I can't answer that question. I do not know the answer to that, but I will ask our friends that are at the table.
To what Charlie was talking about. They started to recharge there at Saltese Flats. And I was wondering if that has reached any kind of a capacity, if more recharge could occur in that Saltese Flats area. You know what I'm talking about at all?
I do. I don't know the answer to the question. It's a great question, but.
Yeah, my understanding is years ago, that used to be a fairly substantial lake.
Was. It's a twin link to Liberty.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was actually bigger than Liberty, but it was very shallow. The
Right,
deepest part was like 6 feet,
right.
so it was drained on purpose. So. But there's just for information, there is a, Doris Morrison, facility out there. There's a study of the aquifer as well as Salty's Lake and the role that it plays in it.
Yeah,
'Cause it's coming back.
our grandkids have taken field trips over there. They're just fascinated by the whole Saltese Flats area.
And let me just put in a little plug here. I just got an email from the county today that the aquifer protection, the APA, will be on the ballot. And that is how that education program is funded. It also helps to fund our stormwater here in the city of Liberty Lake. So just thought I'd share that with you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have to move on to greenhouse gas.
Okay.
Ready?
Can I just ask, because we have the majority of our CPAT team here. Before we move on from this topic, did you guys have any comments, any thoughts that you wanted to share with us, any questions? You have to come up to the microphone, I'm sorry.
Mark Sullivan, one immediate.
Can you hit the button on it?
Is it too tall? I'm just too tall for it?
Okay, there you go.
Okay.
Now it's working.
One thing related to the aquifer that might be somewhat helpful. In the discussions that City of Spokane had last year about their efforts to try to reduce the amount of water used for irrigation, I think the thing they were often looking at was trying to maintain particular flow rates in the river. So as the aquifer gets drawn down further, the river flow rates drop. So I think that'll probably be the driving thing, even if there's a lot of capacity in the aquifer that's untapped. At some point, it might result in flow rates that are so low in the river that you just can't use it. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Hi, Krista Larson. I guess it's more of a comment than a question when it comes to the education portion of this. We would like to see the schools involved in that process and having the youth and the future of Liberty Lake be part of the process because they're the ones who are going to inherit the quote problems that we're talking about. So having them involved and their voices is really important.
So don't let them graduate.
I know. I can only take care of one credit. And I also have to let you know that they are in the middle of AP testing right now. And so if they trickle out, they've got exams to study for. So that's why they're taking off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments or should I proceed?
Maddie, I think you can proceed at this point.
Okay, fabulous. Is it still sharing screen?
It is.
Oh, okay. I must have just clicked something weird so I can't see it. Okay. Let me take that down and make sure I can see what's going on here. Fabulous. Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Maddie and I was realizing as I was about to introduce myself that I'm not sure whether to say good afternoon or good evening when it's 5 o'clock. So good both, I suppose. Thanks for having us. I'm going to talk about the greenhouse gas emission sub-element portion of this. Beth, you can go to the next slide. So there are 4 commerce requirements for the greenhouse gas sub-element. The first is an overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from transportation and land use. Second is per capita reduction in vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. So if I'm saying VMT, that's what I mean. Third is prioritizing reductions that benefit vulnerable communities and maximize co-benefits. And then lastly is reporting on implementation progress every 5 years. Beth, you can go to the next slide. So to that first requirement, showing that there's a actual emissions reduction, we had to have somewhere to start. So we conducted an emissions inventory based on calendar year 2022 data. I think Beth presented on this before, so I'll keep this pretty brief, but local emissions for Liberty Lake totaled about 118,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The vast majority of those, about 62%, came from building energy. So use of electricity, natural gas, and then other fuels like propane and generator diesel. And then the next biggest category was transportation energy, about 25% of all the emissions there. And that's mostly coming from passenger vehicles. And then the remaining categories came from waste disposal, both solid waste and wastewater there, refrigerant use, and land use. Next slide, please. Okay, so this graph's a little bit much to take in, so I'll kind of walk us through it here, but this is showing how Liberty Lake's emissions might change over time. The red line that's on the top and going up is showing unchecked emissions growth. So essentially, if 2022 emissions were to continue to grow based on population growth projections, that's what emissions would look like as we move from current day to 2050. The black line going down is the net zero by 2050 goal line that Commerce has provided guidance on. And then the patterned and sort of lighter color wedges there are showing emissions reduction from state level policies. So we've got the Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act, which requires electricity emissions to go to zero by 2040. We've got the Clean Buildings Performance Standard, which requires increases in building efficiency. This should lead to reductions in both electricity and natural gas use. There's also the Clean Fuels Standard, requiring transportation fuel emissions to decrease 20% by 2034. And then another requirement for all new cars sold in Washington state to be EVs by 2035. And then lastly, there's a smaller category there, but state of Washington rules have a phase out of high global warming potential refrigerants. So that's contributing to the decrease as well. The solid colored wedges here are remaining emissions by source. We can see that kind of dark blue wedge, that's electricity, and then the lighter green wedge, that is gasoline. Those are both decreasing because of those state policies. And then we can see that diesel and natural gas and waste emissions are staying fairly constant and remain kind of above that 2050 goal. So there's a little bit of work to do to reduce those emissions to meet the goal. Next slide, please. So this is very similar to the slide that Beth presented earlier. We followed a similar process for the development of the draft greenhouse gas sub-element goals. But instead of basing it on the resiliency findings that we shared earlier, we looked at the emissions inventory findings to identify what are the largest sources of emissions in Liberty Lake. Then we looked at what emissions remain after state policies are considered to really hone in on what emissions we need to focus on with policies locally. And then we picked through the Commerce menu of measures to select policies that were relevant to Liberty Lake, and then further refined those with the CPAT, city planning staff, and then one-on-one meetings with individuals, my bad. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned at the top of this section, the climate element requires the city to reduce overall emissions in per capita VMT. We saw in the greenhouse gas inventory that buildings, transportation, and waste are the largest sources of emissions in Liberty Lake. And so some best practices that sort of guided our selection of policies are included here. So for buildings, that's efficiency improvements and use of renewable energy. For VMT reduction, that's land use changes to increase density, improve access to transit, and increase use of active transportation modes like walking and biking. For other transportation emissions, that's looking at electric vehicles and using low carbon fuels where appropriate. And then for waste, that's reducing waste, managing it responsibly, and then capturing methane specifically at the wastewater treatment facility. So yeah, like I mentioned, these best practices were kept in mind as we selected goals. Next slide. And you've seen a similar slide to this before, but just to kind of set up how this is structured here, we've got pretty broad goals that filter down into sub goals that are a little bit more specific to align with the best practices that I just shared. And then the policies are the most specific piece here, and they provide information about how the goals or sub goals might be accomplished based on the city's implementation levers. So those include things like incentivizing, educating, collaborating or partnering with other organizations, supporting or advocating, leading by example in some cases, and then updating planning documents. And so for the next about 10 slides, we're going to dive a little deeper into the best practices to reduce emissions in VMT. And then we're going to share the draft goals and sub goals with you all. Next slide. Okay, so for reducing emissions from buildings and energy use, the two best practices here are improving energy efficiency of buildings and increasing the use of renewable energy. When we're talking about efficiency improvements, we're talking about weatherization. So for example, improving insulation, upgrading windows or roofs, things like that. When we're talking about energy efficiency or energy efficient appliances, we're really talking about switching from natural gas furnaces or water heaters to electric heat pumps or electric heat pump water heaters at the point of failure for the existing furnaces and water heaters. So really gaining that efficiency benefit when it's time to replace anyway. And then we also can see some efficiency gains when we look at building size, because smaller buildings require less energy to heat and cool than larger buildings do. And then in terms of renewable energy, we're really talking about putting solar on buildings and other structures when it makes sense and when those buildings and structures can support it. Beth, do you have anything you want to add here?
No, just that a lot of these things all can be done to emphasize cost effectiveness, looking at, where does solar gain make sense? Where can you gain efficiency by swapping out your furnace? So, I just want to emphasize that making sure that these are done at the time of natural replacement and are done to emphasize cost effectiveness is a really important part of these goals and policies.
Thank you. And then next slide. I think similarly might be a little bit obvious after what we've just talked about, but we'll just kind of go through them. So there are two goals related to building energy reduction and emissions, and then there's a couple sub goals for each one. So the first goal is to encourage buildings to use renewable energy, conserve resources, and implement efficient technologies and practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We can do this through education, increasing community awareness of energy efficiency measures and benefits. And then the bottom two here they look very similar, but one is focused on making existing buildings more efficient, and then the other is on making future buildings more efficient, because we know that there's kind of different mechanisms there to make that happen, talking retrofits versus building differently in the first place. Goal number 2 is to promote solar electricity generation and storage. So installing solar on public buildings. We've talked a bit about city buildings, which we can kind of focus on again in a little bit. But then also on other public buildings like schools and things like that. Additionally, promoting solar on private buildings, and then increasing small scale battery storage to pair with local solar generation so that it can be reliable when the sun isn't shining. Any questions or thoughts on the building energy reduction goals? Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so for VMT reduction, there are 3 best practices here as well, and all of these are things that Liberty Lake is already doing in some capacity. So the first is land use changes to increased mixed use development areas. I know this is already ongoing with the current zoning requirements and map there. The second is active transportation improvements to enable people to travel both safely and comfortably on foot or bike or any other sort of active rolling activity that they might choose. I know that this is, an important part of the community for recreation and maybe also for getting around a little bit. So this would really be looking at kind of expanding the existing system and identifying and filling gaps where those are. And then last here is public transit improvements. Obviously, there's already public transit system that serves Liberty Lake through STA. It's a matter of just kind of working with Spokane Transit to improve service, make it a little bit more convenient and reliable, and all of that. So a lot of this really dovetails with other planning efforts that the city is doing. And these aren't necessarily greenhouse gas measures on their face. They do help support reducing emissions, but they also support other efforts as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so for our draft VMT reduction goals, we've got 1 goal and 4 sub-goals here. The primary goal is to reduce VMT to achieve emissions reduction goals. That can be done through fostering higher intensity land uses in mixed development and transit corridors. Also increasing housing diversity and supply within urban growth areas to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support environmental justice. The third is related to transit, so partnering with Spokane Transit Authority and supporting improvements to public transit reliability and convenience. And then lastly, improving the active transportation network. And so again, these are a lot of things that you're already doing through other planning efforts, and they do support the climate element. So you may as well take credit for that good work that's already being done. I'll pause here for questions on the VMT section.
Just a quick question. I find this one most confusing. How do you measure vehicle miles traveled?
So there are different ways you can do it. And one way is kind of through the transit authority. And I don't know off the top of my head what the regional transit authority here does. Do you, Beth? Is it cell phone data?
I don't know the transportation modeling.
Yeah, SRTC uses, they do have a travel demand or a survey, but they also use cell data as part of the basis for their transportation model. And so that's actually a great way to, there's a massive algorithm to use that cell phone data to actually assess vehicle miles traveled.
And then they extrapolate it out and times it by the population of the drivers. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Okay. If there are no other questions, the next slide. Okay, so looking at how to reduce transportation emissions, again, 3 best practices here. The first is to electrify public fleets. So again, looking at replacing vehicles at the time of natural replacement, not obviously dumping your entire existing fleet right now, but when it's time to choose a new vehicle, determine whether that vehicle could be electric in terms of, functionality that it needs and range and all of that. And then one thing with this too is life cycle costs. For EVs, they end up typically being cheaper over the lifetime of the vehicle. And that's because lower fuel costs, electricity is just generally cheaper than using gasoline in the cars for the same amount of range. And then reduced maintenance costs as well. So it could be a strategy for the city to ultimately find some cost savings over time. And then the next one is EV charging infrastructure. So when we're looking at this, I think the trickiest piece here is really existing buildings and specifically multifamily buildings and destinations like grocery stores or golf courses or other places that people frequent and spend time at. And that's because the building code already requires charging infrastructure in new buildings. And then single family homes tend to be a little bit easier to get charging at because the homeowner can just simply decide that they want charging or don't want charging and make that choice for themselves. So really multifamily and destinations is the big one there. And then lastly is alternative fuels. What we're talking about here is renewable diesel, which is also known as R99. It is a drop-in fuel for conventional diesel, and it's been used quite a bit in Oregon and California. I know it's not super prevalent in your neck of the woods just yet, but I believe it'll be increasing in availability here soon. And one thing we learned from the Spokane tribe when we talked to them is that they're working on putting renewable diesel in their pumps on the reservation. So I think it's becoming more available, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on as time goes on because it's an extremely easy way to reduce emissions from diesel. Next slide, please. Okay, so 2 goals related to remaining transportation emissions. First is increase electric vehicle adoption. This would be done through education about EVs, including education about life cycle emissions and batteries. And then the second sub-goal there is expanding electric vehicle infrastructure, particularly in multifamily, like we just talked about. Goal number 5 is explore opportunities for renewable diesel blends, and that would be mainly providing education about these blends to the community or to, large fuel users, things like that. Pause here for questions.
Seeing none.
No? Okay. All right. So goal 6 is to protect local biodiversity, such as fire-resistant trees, to boost carbon sequestration, reduce heat islands, and improve air quality, prioritizing vulnerable and overburdened communities. This is kind of a big goal and it covers a lot, and basically is to acknowledge that Liberty Lake has a lot of trees. It's a tree city. People generally really like trees, but we also don't want them to burn down or contribute to our homes or places that we love burning down. So trying to sort of support the trees that we have because we like them and they also sequester carbon. Yeah, anything to add here, Beth?
No, this definitely interacts strongly with other elements, other parts of the climate element of the comprehensive plan too. So this is sort of a little piece of climate in that carbon sequestration and decreasing heat island effect. But a lot of this is sort of broadly in other parts of the comp plan.
Beth and Maddie, Tom,
Mhm.
since the last time that we talked, I've checked a couple of times with the Vista and I just checked on the website again. There is absolutely nothing within the next 6+ years in their plan to develop renewable diesel. So it's going to have to come from someplace else. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's a realistic goal.
I wouldn't expect it to come from Avista. I would expect it. So there's, Valero has a plant in Texas. And there's one coming online on the Columbia River, sort of at the mouth of the Columbia. So there's a big development coming in there. Also, there's a couple refineries in Anacortes that are in their long-term plan. So I think one's a Sinclair and one is a Marathon. So in their long-term, like 10-year plans, includes switching over to renewable diesel manufacturers. So it's a lot of those already in the diesel game manufacturers that are doing it, and it's being supported in part by all these cap and trade laws all over the West Coast, in combination with a cap and trade program in Quebec. Actually, they're all in a joint market at this point. So, so those
just for us,
markets are supporting it.
yeah, Avista isn't doing anything, and the same with renewable natural gas. Okay. just.
Yeah,
fine, it's being
renewable
done in
natural gas
places,
is,
and it is not on their screen, not even in their goals.
Yeah.
So just look at the last 5-year plan. It's not there. So.
thanks.
So what is out there is being governmentally subsidized?
They're, everything that is the pitch is that the natural gas is doing just fine, and so is hydroelectric. And that's it.
Yeah, but any future development?
Nothing in
I
their
understand, but
future
the
plans.
ones that are doing it right now are probably being subsidized, I guess.
I don't believe that they
I don't
are.
think they
Oh,
are.
really?
Not yet.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, next slide, I think. So, speaking of methane and renewable natural gas, so how to reduce emissions from waste and wastewater, we've got two here. Waste reduction and management is kind of looking at things like recycling, composting, and education. And then methane capture is in relation to the wastewater treatment process. So that produces methane, which is a pretty potent greenhouse gas. It's about 28 times more potent per molecule than carbon dioxide. But it's also, it's renewable natural gas. And so capturing and using that on site can be a way to make use of the gas that's being produced and not release it out into the atmosphere. Next slide. So two goals here. First is to develop targeted campaigns for reducing and managing waste to reduce emissions. And then the second goal there is reduce emissions from waste and wastewater. These are kind of broad goals and sub-goals here. The policies will get a little bit more specific on the how with that, but we're just looking at goals today. Next, please. Okay, and then last goal slide here. So this is to reduce emissions from city operations. So this really takes all of the other goals and best practices that we've just been talking about and saying, okay, let's look at city operations to lead by example so that we're not asking the community to do things that the city itself wouldn't do. So sub goals here include reducing emissions from city buildings and energy use. This could be solar on city buildings. This could be efficiency improvements, etc. Converting the public fleet to zero emission vehicles and developing supporting infrastructure and programs. So charging stations that are publicly accessible potentially. Another one is reducing emissions from employee commute, and then reducing emissions from city operations and purchasing by purchasing lower carbon products and or purchasing fewer new items. So one of the big ones here is concrete. There is lower emissions concrete that can be used in like city construction projects and things. So maybe like ADA ramps or sidewalk repairs or things like that. And then lastly is expanding recycling at city facilities to make that more of a sort of mainstream practice with staff. Any questions on the city ops goals or the waste and wastewater goals?
Does the city do any recycling?
Yes, the city recycles cardboard.
Well, that's wonderful.
Again, I'm
Okay. So just with respect to what can city operations do, I don't know how it pencils out, but the little trailhead golf cart fleet could be converted to lithium ion. Each battery is, I think it's between 3 and 8 kilowatt hours. Solar panels installed in the parking lot could be used to charge those, as well as those golf cart batteries could be used as storage during times when it's not needed. There is it'd be an interesting model for the city to think about.
So one of the things I will say is that with regard to the solar panels, when we designed the clubhouse, We made sure that it was designed to support solar. There were state grants. I'm not sure that there still are state
Yeah.
grants, but there were state grants for installing solar panels in existing public buildings. And so that is something that we're going to look at. We will over time look at an implementation plan. The challenge with, and what we'll have to look at, we'll have to come up with a plan first, because establishing the charging stations for those, and also for staff to be trained to maintain the electric vehicles. Right now, they maintain the existing golf carts and themselves. So there are, it's not that it's not very.
Oh, I
difficult for us to
understand.
do.
It's a different paradigm and, you know,
It's right. It requires some advanced planning to make it happen.
sure.
Sorry.
With respect to 9.3, does the city have a rideshare program for its employees?
We participate in a commute trip reduction program. And we've actually, in fact, Tate Garcia, the receptionist, is our representative on the commute trip reduction program planning committee. Over the course of the last year, the city has increased participation in that by like 20%. So it's something that is definitely being pushed.
So that's like a rideshare program? Yeah.
Well, it could involve riding share, but there's other ways that, we also have the ability to do compressed schedules. We do also, some positions can work from home a day a week or so. And so there's different opportunities for reducing those vehicle miles. There is the ability to do ride shares but yeah.
Joe and I ride share to the meetings. That's all we got.
Good man.
I have a question going back to the recycling. You said the city currently recycles cardboard. I would like to see the goal, at least the language changed for not just city services or city hall or anything like that, but for the community as a general, because doesn't the garbage go to a landfill right now?
Well, there's also they also recycle.
Right, but most of the stuff in the recycle actually doesn't get recycled, or there is a large portion. A lot of the things that go into recycle doesn't actually get recycled because the facility hasn't been updated for that yet. Is my understanding.
They actually have just done a major.
They
update.
did, but there's still a large portion of items that they say are accepted in there that don't actually.
There's an article in today's paper about that.
Okay, and I
They're
haven't
not-
read that, but I have
They're
heard
not
something
using
about that.
it, and the people that went through just talked about that, so. And all of our events are garbage that is tossed and burned.
Right, and well, I don't even think it's burned, right?
Yeah.
From the city,
It goes to the landfill.
it goes to the landfill,
From
right?
Liberty Lake, it goes to the landfill.
It goes to
but
the
from-
landfill.
From the city of Spokane,
Oh,
it
Right.
goes to their incineration.
But and
The
for
waste
this,
energy
for this
facility.
purpose, we're talking about Liberty Lake. And so if we're talking about goals in general, especially when it comes to like waste stuff, it would be nice to have the language in there to not only reduce waste, but to look at alternatives to landfills. I know there's costs associated.
So what I was gonna say, and I'm an ex-garbage geek. So I used to do this for a living. But some of the challenges have to do with markets and how clean the material can be, or can be collected.
Mhm.
It certainly does have a lot to do with different the technologies. Markets wax and wane for different materials. And so that's also one of the challenges. What I will say is that we do have it on and this is what I would suggest if you want to consider a goal, that we are looking at updating our solid waste management plan. And that would be the place to look at how we're approaching these and really comprehensively evaluate how we're managing waste.
Yeah, absolutely, because recycling's its own ball game with contracts and other countries and all this stuff. But as far as like just waste in general, and then you talk about methane being released, it kind of goes hand in hand. So if you're going to an incinerator or an alternative source for that waste, if you will, then that might accomplish two goals in one.
Sure.
As opposed to just going to a landfill.
And we do a lot of leaf and yard waste composting in this community, but food waste composting is a big benefit. So there are again, I'm sorry, you're talking to a garbage geek. When talking about waste, you're not talking about one waste stream, you're talking about multiple waste streams, and it really requires that you dig into the details to know which is the most appropriate, which is the most environmentally sound. But I will say this, without question, the most environmentally sound approach is waste reduction.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that tangent.
Any other questions in the room before we move on? Okay. Okay, so back to a slightly different wonky graphic here. This one's very similar to the one we saw earlier with the reductions from state level policies. But this also takes into account the reduction that we could expect from taking action locally. So our team analyzed emissions impact over time for a few different things here. So for building energy, we looked at building efficiency improvements, the electrification of space and water heating, and rooftop solar installation. And then for transportation, we looked at, I apologize, my dog is barking, so I hope that's not coming through. For transportation, we looked at land uses changes resulting in increased density, city fleet conversion to EVs, and increasing EV capabilities at multifamily dwellings. For each of these, we assumed 100% implementation so that we could understand the technical potential of local action. And that's what you're seeing between the two orange dashed lines in the middle there. So in combination with state action, this gets Liberty Lake like fairly close to that net zero goal line there. And then I wanted to emphasize too that these are a lot of things that in the climate element that appear in other comp plan elements. And so these aren't necessarily unique to reducing emissions for all of them. But this is a way that we can sort of group actions that the city is already taking in order to meet commerce requirements here. So I think with that, I'm going to pass it to Beth to wrap up with some next steps for us here.
Just want to solicit any questions on this one. It's complicated, I will note, but yeah.
It says we're going to have 50,000 metric tons in 2050.
Yeah.
I think that's the basic conclusion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there are some more difficult things to reduce, right? That this still doesn't quite address.
But also you have to realize that between now and 2050, that technology is also going to change. And so we can anticipate that there will be new opportunities for us to further reduce this as we move forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Next steps. All right. So let's pull this one back up. Okay. So the climate and the GHG and resiliency elements are both sort of chugging along, and you will see the the sub elements in front of you as we go through the summer. But I would note that the GHG sub element is on is you're going to see come at you first. So on June 25th, you're going to see the whole GHG sub element, including all the policies for your review. July 1st, that's going to go to the city council for approval because we need to submit it to Commerce for pre-approval on August 15th. So, so our plan is to give them our GHG reduction sub-element, including all the policies and all the calculations and all of that, so that they can sort of vet it because it is quite new. Not a lot of communities have gone through this process yet, and we want to make sure that we are on sound footing after we get it back from Commerce and bring it back through council to make sure that it's as good as it can be. Any questions about the process? And so the resiliency element is sort of following along after the GHG element.
Any questions? Any comments? Any comments from the audience?
I'd like to go back to what you were talking in your garbage geek session, because I appreciate that. I would like to see more education to the public in the 7 R's, not the 3 R's. And share those with you, rethinking what we buy as a conscious consumer of what we need. Refusing products that you don't need. Simple things like getting takeout and, you know, do you need the bag? Do you need the utensils? Do you need the napkins? Reducing what you're buying, reusing things and going back to those times where we would reuse items, find repurpose for them, learning how to repair things. And looking for our manufacturers to get away from planned obsolescence of making things to break, so we have to buy more. Let's go back when we built things the right way. Regifting, and I think as a city, we could have locations where people could exchange things and find new homes for them. And then you recycle. After you've done all of those things, then we look at recycling. But if we don't reduce, it's a losing battle.
Could you go over those 7 again,
Yeah, you
Crystal?
bet.
Rethink, reuse,
Rethink,
reduce.
refuse, reduce, reuse, which goes with repurpose, repair, regift, and recycle.
Nice.
And I think we could do a pretty good campaign around the city. And you know, start at the top of the list and then get to recycle.
And can I just say that for the young people sitting in the audience, your generation has done phenomenal things. Thrifting, you've taken thrifting to a whole new level.
Yeah. And thank you for including us in this process. It's been invaluable to them, but I think also to the members on the committee to get perspective from the people who are going to be living into these 2050, 2070 dates that we've been talking about.
I will say, and I mean this for the entire CPAT, we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't have gotten this far without all of your input. So it's been hugely valuable to us.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay.
Wow, this was a lot. This was a lot. So thank you so much for sitting with us through this complicated journey. So I really, really appreciate everybody's very constructive, very thoughtful input on this. If you've got more, if you want to revisit something, please email me, Lisa. I don't know if my email is anywhere in that packet, but email Lisa and she'll send it to you for sure, or to me. So, for sure.
Thank you so much, Beth and Maddie. Great job.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
for your time and the work. So we're ready to move on to citizen comments. Anyone, anything else anyone would like to comment? Do we have anybody online, Evan? Okay, thank you. And we'll move on to secretary's report.
Yes, if you'll give me 1 second while I get my slideshow going again.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you.
So we have again updated the planning commission calendar, and I promise it'll happen again. I do want to let you know that for our next meeting, March 28th. Or May 28th. I can't get wrap my brain around it.
She only has to present until about 9 o'clock tonight. So.
We're going to be going over a development code checklist, which, oh, by the way, will be updated again by Commerce because there are new laws that were passed this year. I'll give you a little quick summary of those as well. And I think that it's important that you be aware of that as we go into the land use chapter, because the land use chapter, we're going to have to align with all of these changes that we need to make to development code. So it's really in the description. So we're not changing the map. There may be some goals and policies, but I think mostly what it is making sure that the descriptions of each of these of the land uses are inclusive of all the changes that are coming. So we'll have that. And I will, as I did today with the housing chapter, I will give you a cleaned up version of the economic development chapter with a little section added on implementation. There is one other thing that I'm looking at doing, and I'm looking at having our consultant do some employment projections for us that I'd like to add to that chapter. And I think I think it's important, not just for economic development, but I think it's also going to be super valuable as we look at transportation. So that's the updated planning commission calendar. I wanted to also just keep you abreast of the planned public engagement. So May 22nd from 4 to 6 p.m. at Trailhead Event Center, we're going to be having a Parks and Recreation Plan open house. It's going to be fun. I encourage you all to come and share your thoughts. Late May. I'm sorry?
Is that the
Rotary Room? Yes, the Rotary Room.
It's the same, okay.
Okay. Late May through early June, we are going to be doing a sign code virtual open house and visual preferencing survey. And I'm not specific on the dates because it still needs a little work. So we're working with the consultant on that. May 24th through September 13th, you've seen the schedule for comp plan engagement at the farmer's market. And the first one we're going to be doing is housing. And we're presenting the working draft of the housing element to council on Tuesday. And once that happens, we will be sending it out to the school district, to all the utilities, to PD and fire. And I'll be scheduling meetings with them in June to try and understand their capabilities for serving these population projections and what that might mean for capital facilities planning for them.
Do we have visuals for the farmer's market? And do we have any brochures or pamphlets for?
Yes. So one of the things that I was going to say, we're testing out at City Academy tomorrow. We're testing out housing monopoly game that we're going to that we're actually going to have at farmers market. Okay. Yes, we have some graphics. We have a table. We have a tablecloth. staff has it covered. We are planning activities for each of the various topics, as well as some ongoing ones that I think will be some dot exercises and such like that. So June 12th, we will be having a transportation network analysis virtual town hall from 6 to 7:30 p.m. We did that during COVID, and I found that it was really effective for transportation.
What do they do on that?
We're actually looking at the build out for the city and modeling the transportation network and figuring out where we're going to have failures, where we're going to need to make changes to our transportation infrastructure to support this problem.
Is this a Spokane County thing?
This
Is
is,
there an STA thing or what?
this is a City of Liberty Lake thing. So we take, and we've got the updated SRTC transportation model. It's effectively what it is a sub-area transportation plan. We take their model, but we add more of the local network. We add the land uses. We're looking at what we see in the next 3 years. And then we're going to be looking at a mid-range and a build out analysis for it to kind of see what infrastructure change, transportation infrastructure. What's kind of cool
Is
about
it
it.
roads? It's all roads.
No, it's multimodal. We actually, when we took the counts this time, we got counts for pedestrians, we got counts for golf carts, we got counts for bicycles, and we got counts for trucks as well as vehicles. So it's gonna be a multimodal. This transportation plan that we
okay.
do this time, we're actually gonna have to look at multimodal level of service. So, so anyhow, so that's kind of where, this is just kind of the existing conditions is the first virtual open house. And also talking about next steps and whatnot, but it'll be, it definitely will be, worth attending if you are at all interested in where we're going with our
Can
transportation
you
network.
attend it in
Virtually.
person?
Virtual.
It's
No,
virtual.
It's virtual.
It is totally virtual.
Okay.
Because the nature of the modeling and sharing the modeling and whatnot, it's more conducive to being virtual. We are also going to be planning a housing town hall sometime in July and August, and I don't have dates yet, and I don't have the format yet, but again, we're running as fast as we can to get this all together. We will be doing a climate element virtual open house but from mid-June through mid-July, and we're going to take our story map. We're going to be adding the climate, some GHG things to it. We're going to be providing some surveys within it. It's going to be pretty cool. And August 2nd, of course, we've got the comp plan booth at Barefoot in the Park. And so we will be building things out. A couple other things that I wanted to share with you. As I mentioned, for our climate grant for the second biennium, we did include, based upon the work that we've done thus far with the climate report, we did include a transportation resiliency study. I think that's going to be critical, and it's also going to be critical to our hazard mitigation planning. We also beefed up the engagement, and again, based upon what we've heard from the community, and from what we've heard from our goals and policies. Number one, we know that the biggest greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest way we can impact it is building efficiency. So we are going to be doing clean energy, building efficiency town hall where people can actually, and we're hoping to have some things where people can actually figure out what the return on investment is for installing solar panels and things like that, and really educating people on what the benefits of some of the technologies are from a cost saving standpoint. So I think it'll really resonate. The other one that we're planning on doing is a fire-wise town hall. And I think that's, again, I think that's something that everybody needs to be aware that there are things that we can do in our own homes and in our own yards and in our own lives to try and reduce the potential for wildfire, as well as things for the community at large.
Is that with the Valley Fire Department,
Yeah,
Frank?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, no, we're not doing it. We're getting partners to help us with these.
Lisa,
Yes.
not to drag on the meeting any more than we need to, but during that portion of your presentation, the housing town hall, as I heard in our previous workshop, discussions about transitioning from this to that, meaning furnaces and so on and so on. It's more than just equipment, as you well know. It's even just to put solar panels on a house, you got to be able to receive it. You got to be able to manage it once you get it. And a lot of these older homes aren't equipped for that way.
Understood.
So I would just ask that that be part of that equation
Absolutely.
as it relates to cost, because going from a gas furnace to an electric furnace, a lot of I built houses all the way back into the 90s, and it's a 200 amp service, and you're not going to get there on a 200 amp service. So now it's a 400 amp service. You see what I'm saying? So those are big equations in that discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely. No question about it.
Thank you.
With that, I had one more question. Again, I would invite you all, if you're interested, to come to the city council meeting on Tuesday, and because we will be talking about the work that you've already done on the housing element. The other thing is, does somebody want to do a report at city council on Tuesday?
Come on. You gotta be kidding. Nobody wants the
I'll be in
visibility.
Boston. I'd be more than happy to help. but I can't.
Nobody wants the visibility, huh? Oh, good. Maybe I'll just designate somebody.
Bill was getting ready to volunteer.
Bill, you volunteering? Thank you. Well, while he's thinking about that, let's move on. Any planning commissioner reports?
Glad y'all got to meet this CPAC group.
Yeah.
They're really good kids.
What is what's the acronym stand for?
CPAC, Climate Policy Advisory Team, and Mark's on it too. Since we didn't do intros.
And what do they do?
We've been meeting
They're-
for the last few months, talking about this.
They're doing the heavy lifting on the climate chapter. You guys are just getting the high level stuff.
Oh, okay. Well, good job, guys.
Good job, Mark.
So we'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Is there a second? All in favor?
All right.
Aye. Thank you. We are adjourned.
No.